My dad knocked. Your brother starts college. Sign the apartment over. He'd spent 6 years telling relatives a man bought it for me. At the graduation, I handed my aunt the mortgage and asked her to read the second name. He didn't ring the buzzer. He knocked on the actual door of flat 3, which meant somebody in the building had let him into the stairwell, which meant he'd stood outside and waited for a neighbor and told them he was my father. I had a tea towel over my shoulder and rice on. It was 8:20 on a Tuesday in June. He had a document wallet under his arm, the plastic kind with a press stud, and he didn't take his shoes off, and he walked past me into the middle of my own front room and stood there looking at the ceiling rows like a surveyor. He said, Ilario starts in September. I said, I know. And he said, so, we'll get this signed over and that's the fees sorted. That's the whole conversation as he understood it, not a request. An announcement of a decision reached in a room I hadn't been in. What my father did not know, what he had spent 6 years making certain he could never find out because finding out would have required him to look at a piece of paper, was that there was a second name on my mortgage and that the woman it belonged to had been dead for 2 years. I bought 412 Hobson Street when I was 23, and I have never once been allowed to say that sentence in my family without somebody adjusting it. It's a 1-bedroom, 3rd floor, no lift, in a converted 1930s block near the Ring Road. It cost $138,000. I'm a transit systems planner, which means I do bus and tram routing for a regional authority, which is not glamorous and which I love. And at 23, I earned $31,400 and had saved for 4 years in a way that involved not really going anywhere. The deposit was $16,000. I had $11,200 of it. The 4 years of saving were not interesting, and I'll do them briefly, but I want them in because the whole argument my family had about that flat was an argument about whether these 4 years existed. I lived at home until I was 22 and paid $300 a month. I had a car for 11 months and then sold it and used the bus, which I could do because I planned bus routes for a living and knew exactly how bad it would and wouldn't be. I did not go to Naria's hen weekend in Lisbon and told everybody I had a work thing. I ate an enormous amount of pasta. I had a spreadsheet with a line on it called Target 16,000 and a running total, and I updated it on the 28th of every month. And when I got to $9,000, I bought myself a coat that cost $60 and felt sick about it for a week. 4 years, $11,200, and 1 half day off work to drive an old woman to a bank. Everybody in my family knows the price. Nobody in my family has ever known where the other $4,800 came from, and there is a reason for that, and the reason is the whole story. My father, Abelard, is a warehouse supervisor, 59, and he has one organizing belief, which is that things happen to women and are done by men. That's not me being clever. It's a genuinely consistent worldview, and you can predict him with it. When my cousin Naria got a promotion, my father's account was that her boss liked her. When my Aunt Rosora's house went up in value, my father's account was that her late husband had bought well. When I bought a flat at 23, there had to be a man, so he invented one. I don't think he sat down and decided to lie. That's the thing that makes it hard to be angry in a clean way. I think he said something at a christening. She's got herself set up. There's somebody helping her. I don't ask. And it went round, and it came back to him improved. And by the second year, it had a shape. An older man, married probably, and my father saying he didn't want to talk about it, and my mother saying nothing at all. I found out about it 11 months in from Naria in a car park at another christening. She asked me, genuinely kindly, genuinely worried, whether I was all right and whether he was still helping with the flat. I said, who? And she said, oh God, B, I'm sorry, forget I said anything. And then, because she is incapable of leaving a thing alone, it's just, your dad said. Here's what I did about that, which I've had 6 years to be ashamed of. Nothing. I said, there isn't anybody. I bought it myself. And Naria said, right, no, of course, in the voice people use when they think you're covering, and then we went inside and ate a buffet. You cannot disprove a rumor by denying it. Denial is the shape the rumor predicts. If I said there was no man, that was what a woman with a man would say. What I needed was a document, and I had one the whole time, and I didn't use it for 6 years, because using it would have meant explaining my grandmother. My grandmother was Ondina Fry, my mother's mother, and she was 81 when I bought that flat. She'd been a machinist and then a supervisor at a hosiery factory that closed in 1996, and she was not a warm woman in the way people mean when they say that. She was funny in a dry, quite cruel way, and she noticed everything, and she gave nothing away in either sense. She lived in a bungalow in Corley with a phone in the hall, and a very specific rule that you rang on Sundays. In the February before I bought, she asked me to drive her to the bank, not the post office, not the shop, the bank, the branch in town, on a Wednesday, which meant taking a half day, and she asked me to come in with her, and then, at the door said, wait there, and went to a desk on her own for about 25 minutes while I stood by a rack of leaflets about ISAs. On the way home, she said, how much are you short? I said, what? She said, for the flat. You're short. You've been doing the face. I said about 5,000, and she said, right, and then talked about a hedge for the rest of the journey. 3 weeks later, my solicitor rang me and asked whether I understood that my grandmother intended to be a co-borrower and had already been credit assessed. And I said out loud in an open plan office, she's what? Ondina Fry went on the mortgage. Not as a gift, not as a loan, not as a transfer of $4,800 into my account. She went on the mortgage as a joint borrower with a nominal interest at 81, which lenders can do and mostly don't, and she did it because she'd worked out correctly before I had that my deposit shortfall wasn't really the problem. The problem was that at 23, on $31,400 with a 4-year employment history, I was at the edge of what they'd lend. Her name plugged the gap. The $4,800 she put in as well was almost a side issue, and she made me promise not to tell my parents. I asked her why. We were in her kitchen and she was doing something to a pair of shoes with a cloth. She said, "Because your father will make it about him." I said, "It's got nothing to do with him." And she said, "Beatrice, if he knows I helped you, then it becomes a thing I did for you and didn't do for the boy. And then it's a war and I'm 81 and I haven't got the time." Then she said the thing I've turned over ever since. "Anyway, he'll invent something. Let him. It'll say more about him than about you." I was 23. I said, "Okay." I have thought since that she was protecting herself from a fight she'd already had once, and that I never asked her about that, and that I can't now. We had a Sunday call for 4 years after that. 20 minutes. Always 6:10. She never once asked about the mortgage. She asked about the flat, whether I'd done anything about the damp in the bathroom, whether the man upstairs was still using the washing machine at midnight, but never the loan, which I understood eventually was deliberate. She decided that if she asked, it would become a debt, and she was determined that it wouldn't be. In the second year I tried to give her money back. I'd had a small pay rise, and I offered her $200 a month. She said, "Don't be soft." I said, "It's yours." And she said, "It's the bank's and it's yours, and it's got nothing to do with me, and if you put money in my account, I'll spend it on a cruise out of spite." Then at the end of that call, and this is the only time she ever came near it, she said, "Has he said anything?" I said, "Who?" She said, "Your father, about the flat." And I said, "He said a few things." And there was a pause on the line, and my grandmother said, and then, "Right, well," and asked about the damp. She died 2 years ago, in the January, quickly, which she'd have wanted, and I did the reading at the funeral. My father spoke as well. He talked for 4 minutes about what a proud woman she'd been, and how she'd never asked anybody for help in her life. And about 11 people said afterwards what a lovely tribute it was. And I stood at the back of a crematorium with a mortgage deed in a drawer at home and said nothing. 6 years of the man. That's the part it's hard to convey without sounding self-pitying, because nothing happened. Nobody was cruel to my face. It's a low hum, a slight adjustment in a room when you walk in, a cousin's boyfriend being a bit too jokey, an uncle saying, "And how's the flat?" with a particular emphasis. My mother Constanza never once contradicted it, which I count as the injury. She'd say, "Your father talks nonsense," and then change the subject, which is not the same as saying it out loud. And my brother Ilario grew up inside it. He's 10 years younger. He was 12 when I bought the flat. He is now 18, and he has been marinating since primary school in a household where his sister's flat came from a man, and I have to keep reminding myself that he did not choose the water he was swimming in. The demand escalated over about 7 weeks, and it went like this. Week 1 was the Tuesday knock. The document wallet had a quitclaim form in it, printed off, with my name typed in the wrong box and Ilario's spelled Ilario. I said no. I said it calmly, and then I said it about 4 more times, and then he told me I was being selfish and left, and I put the rice on again because it had gone cold. Week 2, the ants started. 3 calls in 6 days. Rosora's opener was, "Nobody's saying it isn't yours, love, but..." That's the sentence, isn't it? Nobody's saying it isn't yours, but. Week 3 was my mother crying on the phone about how the family was tearing itself apart, which is a sentence that always arrives from the person doing least to stop it. That call lasted 51 minutes, and I remember the number because I looked at it afterwards. She said, at one point, "You've always had to be the one who's right." I said, "I've never once been the one who's right in that house." She said, "You know what I mean." Then she said, "It's only bricks, B." And I said, "It's 4 years of not going anywhere." And my mother said, "Well, nobody asked you to do that," which is, when I unpack it, the single most revealing sentence anybody said to me in the whole 7 weeks. Nobody asked you to do that, meaning the saving was a hobby, a choice you made for your own amusement, like a marathon, and now here's a real thing that a real member of this family needs. I got off the phone and stood in the kitchen for a while, and then I did the washing up very slowly, and I remember thinking, she's not lying to me. She actually thinks that. Week 4 was the lender. I got a call from my mortgage provider's fraud team asking me to confirm some details. Somebody claiming to be a co-owner had contacted them asking about the terms for assuming the mortgage, and had given the correct address and the correct approximate balance, and could not answer the security questions. The woman on the phone was called Perdita Equemi, and she said in a very careful voice, "Are you in any difficulty at home?" And I said no, and she said, "I'm going to put a marker on this account," and I have thought about her kindness a lot since. It took me 2 days to prove I was myself. That sentence sounds like a figure of speech, and it isn't. The marker Perdita put on the account was the right thing to do, and it also meant that every automated system in that organization now treated my account as compromised, which meant I could not access it, which meant I had to be verified by a human, which meant a callback window between 9 and 5 on a working day. I took 2 half-days. I sat in a meeting room at work called Ribble with the blind down, being asked what my monthly payment was to the penny, what date the direct debit went out, what the last 4 digits of the account it came from were, and what my mother's maiden name is, which is Fry, which is the name of the second borrower on the mortgage, which nobody on that call had any reason to connect to anything. At the end of the second call, the man said cheerfully, "All sorted. Sorry about that. Somebody's been having a go at you." I said, "It's my dad." There was a silence of about 3 seconds, and then he said, "Right," in the voice of a man who has heard it before and is not permitted to say so. And then he said, "I'll note it as a family dispute rather than attempted fraud if that's all right with you." I said yes. I have thought about that a lot since. He gave me the softer category and I took it. And I don't don't know to this day whether that was kindness or whether it was the last time I protected my father out of habit. I went back to my desk and did 40 minutes of work on a school-run timetable for the Corley Loop and then went and sat in my car for a bit. Week 5 was Ilario at my door. He'd come on the bus. He was 18 and wearing a shirt, which broke my heart a bit because it meant he'd dressed for it. He had a speech. It was about fairness and about how I'd had my chance and how mom and dad had nothing. And he got about 2/3 of the way through it and then stopped and looked at the floor and said, "Is it true though about the someone bought it for you?" And there it was, 18 years old, in a shirt, in my hallway, asking me if I was a kept woman, because that is what he had been told since he was 12 by everybody he trusted. I said, "No." He said, "Right." And I said, "Ilario, do you want to see the paperwork?" And my brother, and I understand this now though it took me a while, said, "No, it's fine," and left because he was 18 and he could not afford for it to be untrue. If it was untrue, then his parents had lied to him for 6 years, and then what was he supposed to do about September? The night after Ilario came, I did something I've never admitted to anybody. I got the plastic wallet out of the drawer at about 11 o'clock, and I sat on the floor of my own hallway with the mortgage deed and my grandmother's letter on the carpet in front of me, and I very seriously considered burning them. Not dramatically. I thought about it the way you think about any option. If they didn't exist, there'd be nothing to prove. And if there was nothing to prove, then I could sign the flat over, and my brother would go to college, and my mother would stop crying on the phone, and I would still, at the end of it, know what I had actually done. And knowing would have to be enough. I sat there for probably half an hour, working out how much of my life I was prepared to pay to make my family comfortable. The answer in the end was not the flat. But I want to be honest that it took 30 minutes, and it was closer than it should have been, and that what stopped me wasn't principle. It was that I picked up the letter to put it back and read the last line again. Don't wave it about until you need to. And understood that my grandmother had written it in the future tense on purpose. She hadn't written "you'll want this if," she'd written "when." She knew this exact night was coming. She'd known it 6 years before I did. Week 6 was the christening equivalent, a baptism actually for Neria's second, where my father made a toast and said, holding a glass, "To the generous men in this family," and looked at me, and about 4 people laughed and about 12 didn't. I left before the cake. My mother texted at 10 that night to say I'd embarrassed everybody by leaving early. Week 7 was the notary. A woman rang me on a Thursday afternoon to confirm an appointment. I said I hadn't made an appointment. She said, "It's for a transfer of equity at 412 Havison Street," and gave a date, 11 days out, at my parents' address. I sat down on a stack of route surveys in a meeting room at work. I said, "Can you send me the paperwork?" She could, and she did, because I was the registered proprietor and it was my address on the form. It arrived that evening. A transfer form, filled out, with my name typed on the signature line and the transferee given as Abelard Solano. And, this is the part that took my breath, the property description was right. Title number, plan reference, everything. Somebody had bought the official copies from the land registry for $3, which meant somebody had looked at the register. The register lists the proprietor. It doesn't list the mortgage borrowers. But if you buy the register, you get the charges section. And the charges section names the lender and the date of the charge. And if you'd read it at all, with any attention, you'd have wondered why a 23-year-old's charge was dated the same day as a joint application. And you'd have asked. He didn't. He got the document that proved he was wrong, and he used the bit of it that helped him, and he never turned the page. I rang the notary back on the Friday and canceled the appointment. She was very brisk about it. She said, "Can I ask, did you instruct this?" I said no. She said, "Do you want me to record that?" And I said, "Yes, please." And she said, "Then I'll note that the registered proprietor contacted the office and stated she had not instructed the transfer and does not consent to it," and typed for a few seconds and said, "That's on the file now. If anybody rings me about that address, that's what they'll be told." It took 90 seconds. 11 days before a completion that would have taken my flat off me, and it cost nothing. And it took 90 seconds. And the only reason it happened at all is that a stranger in an office had posted me a copy of a form because I asked for it. I did not tell my father I'd canceled it. That's the one genuinely tactical thing I did in the entire 7 weeks. I let the date sit there, and I let him believe it was happening, because I wanted him standing in a room with the aunts when he found out, and not on the phone where he could reshape it afterwards. Ilario's graduation was on the 4th of July, in a school hall with plastic chairs and a PA system that whined. I nearly didn't go. Neria talked me into it in a text exchange that ran to about 90 messages. I sat 4 rows back. My parents were at the front with the aunts. Rosora had a corsage on, actually a corsage, for a 6th form leavers ceremony, which tells you what my brother meant to that family and what he was carrying. He got his certificate. He looked for me in the crowd, which I hadn't expected, and found me, and did a very small nod. I want to be clear that I had not decided to do it at that point. I had the wallet in my bag because I'd had the wallet in my bag for 2 weeks, the way you carry an umbrella. There was no plan. There was a plastic wallet and a school hall and a whining PA, and a boy in a shirt doing a small nod at his sister from a stage. What decided it was overhearing my father in the foyer afterwards, telling a woman I didn't recognize, one of the other parents, that they were sorting the fees out, family helps family, and then, when she asked how, saying, well, his sister's been very lucky, 6 years, and it was still the same 3 syllables. Afterwards, there were tea urns and squash in the foyer, and everybody stood around in groups, and my father was holding court by the notice board, and I went and stood at the edge of of the ants. I'd brought a plastic wallet, his kind, actually, the press stud kind, which was not deliberate, and which I noticed halfway through the ceremony and found funny in a bleak way. Inside it, the official copy of the register, and the mortgage deed, and my grandmother's letter. I waited until my father had finished the story he was telling. Then I said, "Auntie Rosora, will you do me a favor?" She said, "Of course, love." And I handed her the mortgage deed, open, folded back at the first page, and I said, "Would you read out the borrowers?" She put her glasses on. That took about 8 seconds, and nobody said anything during it, which is how I knew the whole group had already worked out that something was happening. She read, "Beatriz Alcina Solano Fry," and then she stopped. I said, "And the second one?" And my Aunt Rosora said, "Ondina Margarita Fry," in a completely different voice, and looked up at my mother. Here's what happened in the next 90 seconds, in order, because I've been over it a lot. My mother said, "Mum wouldn't have," not to me, to Rosora. My father said, that's a guarantor thing, that's different," which is how I knew he understood exactly what it was, because a man who didn't understand wouldn't have known there was a distinction to reach for. Rosora said, "It says borrower, Abelard," and my father said, "She was 90. She was 81. He didn't know that either." Then I gave Rosora the letter and asked her to read that too, and she read the first 2 lines out loud and then stopped and read the rest of it silently with her hand over her mouth. It's short. It's dated 4 days before the completion, and it's in my grandmother's handwriting, which is small and slanted, and which I can't look at for very long even now. "Beatriz, you'll want this one day when they're all saying whatever they're saying. I've signed for you because you asked for nothing, which is the wrong reason to get nothing. I offered the same to your brother's education fund, and your father wouldn't have it. His exact words were that the boy would be provided for properly. I've told him I think that's pride, and he's told me it's principle. Keep this. Don't wave it about until you need to. Gran, I offered the same to your brother's education fund, and your father wouldn't have it." That's the sentence that changed the room, not the second name, that one. Because it meant that the money my father was standing in a school hall trying to take out of my flat had been offered to him for exactly this purpose, 6 years earlier, and he had refused it, because accepting it would have meant admitting that his mother-in-law had already helped his daughter, and that his daughter had not been bought by a man. He would rather his son had no fund than that his daughter had earned a flat. Rosora handed the letter to my mother. My mother read it standing up in a foyer with a plastic cup of squash in her other hand, and then she put the cup down on the notice board shelf and went outside. My father said, "This is a lovely thing to do at your brother's graduation." And Ilario, who had come over halfway through and who nobody had noticed arrive, in his shirt, holding a certificate and a cardboard folder, said, "Dad, just that, one word." And my father stopped talking, which I had never in my life seen anybody make him do. I went outside about 10 minutes after my mother did. She was standing by the school's bike racks with her arms folded, not crying, looking at a hedge. I said, "Did you know she'd offered?" And my mother said, "No." Then she said, "But I knew she'd have wanted to," which is not the same answer, and we both heard it, and neither of us said anything for a while. A caretaker went past with a trolley of chairs. Then she said, "6 years ago, I asked your father whether we should say something about what people were saying, and he said if we made a fuss, it'd look like there was something to make a fuss about." I said, "And you thought that was reasonable?" And my mother said, "I thought it was easier." 2 of the aunts apologized inside a fortnight. Rosara came to the flat with a plant and sat on my sofa and cried and said, "6 years, Bia." And I said, "Yeah, and let it be uncomfortable, because it should have been." The third aunt, Rosalba, has never mentioned it and treats me exactly as she did before, which I've decided to accept as her version of an apology, because at 71 she's not going to produce another one. My mother and I are in the early part of something. She said on the phone in the October, "I should have said something." And I said, "Yes." And she said, "I didn't know how to without it becoming a whole thing." And I said, "That's the same sentence again, Mum." And she went quiet. And then she rang the following Sunday anyway, and has done since. That's about where we are. My father tells people the letter was forged. He said it to at least 2 relatives. Nobody has picked it up and run with it, which is the first time in 29 years that one of his versions hasn't traveled. And I think that's the actual consequence in this story, not the flat, which was never at risk. He has simply stopped being believed. Ilario moved in with me in the September. He's in the front room on a sofa bed doing his first year at the city campus, paying me 1/3 of the utilities because he insisted. And he leaves cereal bowls everywhere, and he is the best company I have had in 6 years. He asked me, in about the 3rd week, whether Gran had ever said anything about him. I read him the letter, all of it, out loud, in the kitchen, with the extractor fan on because he'd burned something. He said, "So she did want to." I said, "She did." And he said, "Right," and washed the pan and didn't say anything else about it for 2 days, and then over dinner said, "Can I get a copy of that?" The recorded mortgage is in a frame in my hallway. I know exactly how petty that is. I've had 2 people ask me what it is, and I've had to explain, and both times it was excruciating, and I'm keeping it up. Because for 6 years, the only story about that flat was one that a man invented at a christening because he could not imagine the true one. And the true one is a woman of 81 taking a half day to sit at a desk in a bank for 25 minutes while her granddaughter waited by a rack of leaflets and never telling a single soul.